climate change investigative reporter. And today we're going to be talking about during this pandemic, how the federal, state governments have been in a number of industries are using the pandemic basically to pursue anti-environmental actions. For example, the Trump administration, which is consistently pro big business and talks about energy dominance. Um, okay, so I'm just checking here to make sure that I have done this properly. I think I am. Yes. Let me type in, we've started anyway. So the Trump administration, which is very openly pro big business and talks about be energy dominance. For example, the Environmental Protection Agency, despite its name, is pushing to relax auto emissions. Now, President Obama in 2012 wanted to have cars and light trucks reduce their emissions 5% a year. And now the Trump administration says that they want to reduce that to 1.5% per year. And that's even though the industry has already said that they're willing to do 2.4%. So they're going less than what the industry is willing to do, fewer restrictions. So that means more, literally tons more carbon dioxide in the air and more pollution and more people, dying from that pollution. And so the EPA has also said they will not fine people for pollution, fine manufacturers now during this pandemic, saying that because it's a critical period, which it is, but during this critical period, it will not fine anybody for any of the industries for air, water, or other types of hazardous pollution, and pollution of the air, pollution of the water, or releasing of any hazardous chemicals. Because we're not going to go after them now, and a number of the states as well, Kentucky and South Dakota and West Virginia also talked about passing law. They passed laws saying they will punish protesters who disrupt any critical infrastructure, meaning the pipelines. So let's see. Yes, I think we're still on. And by the way, on Wednesdays, Jonathan Larson will be back tomorrow, but he'll be doing up to this point Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday, and I'll be doing this video, basically a webcast on Wednesdays and Fridays at 11:30 a.m. Eastern time. So I'm hoping that we are okay. One person is watching. Good. So I know at least somebody watching. Good morning. So we're talking about now during this pandemic, some of the anti-environmental actions being taken, not by only the federal government, but also by the states like Kentucky, South Dakota, and West Virginia. So they would actually penalize protesters if they disrupted what they're calling the critical infrastructure. Now, I'm assuming they're not talking about peaceful protests because that would be in violation, of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the right to peacefully assemble. If they're doing that, then democracy is, breaking down in those states. New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Illinois have now banned the use of the reusable bag that a lot of people are starting to use for grocery shopping to limit the number of plastic bags. As we know, the plastic bags are not, it takes 10,000 years to recycle some of the plastic, and we've heard of and seen pictures of in the Pacific Ocean, an island of plastic the size of Texas. So we know that we've got to start limiting that, but because of the pandemic and because of the possibility of contamination in those bags, the states of New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Illinois are now banning those reusable bags. And Maine is postponing its ban on plastic bags, and which the plastics industry is certainly welcoming. Now, about 6 days ago, I published my first article called "Under the Cover of the Coronavirus: Trump and Big Oil Strike." And let me just read to you the beginning of what I said there. While America is focused on the very public and critical war of survival against the coronavirus, COVID-19, the Trump administration, some Republicans, and fossil fuel companies, and now we might add other companies as well, are continuing to wage another war against the environment and renewable energy. Quietly and occasionally wrapped in patriotism, it's a concerted effort and a continuation of the president's big business worldview and so-called energy dominance. This anti-environment war is being waged at least in part by the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Energy, the Commerce Department, the Department of Interior, and its Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and Bureau of Land Management, as well as allies such as Republican James Inhofe of Oklahoma and Harold Hamm, the billionaire founder of Continental Petroleum. Only a handful of Democratic members of Congress and environmentalists have publicly attempted to combat it. But they did successfully combat bailing out big oil, because on March 10th, President Trump had said that he would uh, fill up the strategic petroleum reserve, the tanks along the Gulf of Mexico that the United States actually has as a backup, that he would fill them to capacity, which would mean about 77 million barrels of oil, costing roughly $2.3 billion. Now with the price of oil dropping, maybe a little bit less. But that was successfully stopped I guess, by push by environmental lobbyists, as well as a number of Democrats in the House of Representatives and in the Senate. And along those lines, right now, while we're talking about all this stuff being done against the environment, you've not heard, I've certainly not heard of anybody talking about, and at least in any of the federal or state governments or major industries, saying let's use this period of time and invest in renewable energy. In other words, the workers that will lose their jobs in the coal industry or in the other fossil fuel industries, they could be moved over to doing renewables like solar and wind turbines and manufacturing of that and building of that and putting them out. And there have been no suggestions, for example, of forming a WPA, which was done by Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s Depression, when they had to put people to work and they built all the buildings and roads. And that could be done now. And, all that talk about where are we going to get $1 trillion for Bernie Sanders, Medicare for All plan. Now, well, we've come up with, the US has come up with $2.2 trillion. Certainly understandable that it's necessary in this pandemic to deal with the pandemic, but there is a way to deal with it that doesn't totally exclude renewables. And totally, at this point, there's no talk at all about investing in the future. And certainly during a pandemic, this could be a wake-up call that saying, look, a number of scientists have pointed out that the reduction of the habitat for wildlife has forced more and more animals to interact that normally would not interact, and therefore transmit more diseases, including viruses like COVID-19. And so that's something that should be talked about, that this is could be an opportunity to start talking about solar energy, wind, geothermal, and also, certainly more forestation as opposed to deforestation. In that article, and by the way, if you go to TYT Investigates, you can you'll see my article. It has a picture of Harold Hamm, the billionaire oil founder of Continental Resources. His picture is at the top of it. But also in there, I talked about and I mentioned a number of different things that the federal government's doing, like the Environmental Protection Agency this is now 2 weeks ago, initiated a 30-day perspective on its scientific transparency rule. And that would limit the use of science in regulatory decisions. It's also rushing to complete its safer, affordable, fuel-efficient vehicles rule, and which, as I mentioned earlier, contrary to what its name implies, would lower vehicle emission standards. And now, in fact, they have lowered it to 1.5%, as opposed to what President Obama in 2012 had pushed for 5% and passed. The Department of Interior, through its U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, is closing comment on ending the Migratory Bird Treaty of 1918. So we're talking about a treaty from a law from 102 years ago, which allowed prosecution of oil and gas companies for killing birds during operations. Now, without prosecution, the fear is that millions of birds could be killed. The department is also pushing to scrap clean water and energy efficient light bulb regulations. Its Bureau of Ocean Energy Management is continuing fossil fuel leasing and is offering 78 million acres along the Gulf of Mexico. 400,000 went for $93 million, half of what it went for in the last sale. and that would be to they're selling it basically to set up oil rigs and setting up equipment to do more oil drilling. And in the next 2 weeks, the Bureau of Land Management, next week, the Bureau of Land Management will auction off oil and gas leases on federal lands in Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, and Nevada. The auctions come at a time when the country is focused on a pandemic and oil prices are at the lowest in a decade, meaning the big companies, big oil companies, may pick up bargains against slim or next to none competition. Now, uh, a stated belief among a number of, or at least a few environmental groups, or some of the environmental groups, is that the Trump administration is attempting to make as many regulatory changes as possible in case President Trump loses in November. And right now he's in one poll, and I think it's the Siena poll, he's 9 points behind Joe Biden. So anyway, these are, while the environmentalists did succeed in stopping a bailout for big oil, they have not been able to so far get any renewable energy or any environmental laws on the books, and it's just the opposite. That under the cover of the pandemic, we have a lot of regulations by the federal and state governments against the environment. And I don't know if I've done something wrong here. I hope I haven't, but I see that I am on, and we only have one person. Who do we have watching? Okay. We don't have a lot of people watching, so I don't have a lot of comments yet. Feel free to comment on the chat. Let's see if I got the chat right. All messages are visible. Okay, I'm going to type in that we are 5. Oops. Okay. Well, okay. Okay, we're on the chat, so we are live, and I have been talking about during this pandemic the anti-environmental actions being taken by the federal government, state governments, and certainly a number of businesses are welcoming it. For example, the airline industry, which is getting $35 billion through a bailout, and no environmentalists are arguing they shouldn't get anything to bail out, but there has been no discussion or requirement by the federal government as it gives taxpayer money to these airline industries, no requirement for renewables, no requirement, for example, to make more efficient airplanes, no requirement to try and experiment with electrical airplanes or even solar, or no requirement, not for the industry, but certainly no discussion on the part of the federal government or state governments about improving our rail system, which is more energy efficient. And I noticed that in some cities in Europe now, they are starting to talk about setting up more, using more traffic lanes for bicycles to encourage the use of bicycles. And I know that was discussed in New York City as well. New York City does have a pretty good system, at least in Manhattan, of bike lanes that are possible and are used a lot by commuters as well as a lot of delivery persons. So I don't see any comments here, so I don't know if anyone's watching, but we've been streaming for 13 minutes, and I don't know if I'm doing something wrong here. Let's see. Nope, we are still going live here. Nope, that's it. So anyway, it's been 15 minutes. I will continue trying to talk. If you've just joining us, hang on a second. I'm going to try and see if I'm not getting the comments properly. Okay, we are Yeah, I think we're still live. We're still going live, and um, nobody's joining my party. Okay, so let's continue then. Um, the What we're talking about is during this pandemic, which we certainly have to address. And I might point out that not all environmentalists agree with what I'm saying and talking about. Gernot Wagner, a climate economist from NYU, in an article, in a quote to me, he said that, um, and when I asked him my question about the bailout of shale oil companies, he said, in short, bailing out US shale oil producers is bad for the climate, much like bailing out the airlines or any other high carbon industries without any conditions is bad for the climate. That said, and he wrote this a week ago, that said, right about now, I couldn't care less about what COVID-19 means for CO2 emissions. I care about CO2 emissions because I care about people, and people are dying right now. Let's focus on that. Sure, let's avoid making things worse on climate while we're at it, but let's not forget to focus on what's truly important. Um, so, certainly, while we focus, and the country has taken some action in trying to deal with the coronavirus. I mean, Governor Andrew Cuomo in New York has been a good example, I think, of, or is viewed as a good example of someone who's asking everybody, to stay home and not go outside. And although that's probably driving a lot of people stir crazy, um, a lot of families stir crazy, that's necessary so that the virus, a highly contagious virus, COVID-19, is not spread more. And there's a little bit of glimmer of hope. I've read that in New York, they think it's starting to peak, but it's not started to go down yet. It would not yet, what they're saying, flatten the curve, meaning the number of new cases. So while the country is focusing on that, the point is that this would be a time when you're spending $2.2 trillion to spend some of it for renewables, because it's so important to be able to do that. Um, all right. So far, we have one person watching, and I'm going to check to see if I'm doing something wrong here where I'm not reaching out to people, or everyone's just so busy. Uh, and I don't see any comments. Maybe I'm not seeing that right. Some messages such as potential may not be able to visible. All messages are visible. Okay. Well, that's what I've been talking about during the pandemic, anti-environmental actions taken by the federal and state governments. And at this point, since only one person is watching, I think that's me, and I'm just talking to myself here, I am going to sign off and see if I've done something wrong and trying to do this better somehow. Anyway, Jonathan Larson will be back tomorrow. I will be back on Friday with another topic talking about climate change. I'm T.Y. Chang from TYT Investigates. Take care. Stay safe.